All right, here we go. This is Kinesiology 230. This is chapter number 23. And we're talking about resistance training for clients who are athletes. And with this series of presentations, you'll have several that'll come from the book. And the book has a few items that they kind of highlight. And I know you see later on in a quiz, I know you see later on in the exam. But I have to tell you, when you start talking about training athletes, it's a different animal, and it's something that I've done for a number of years. It's actually where I started my career. So to that end, I'm pretty eager to jump into this and kind of impart some of the knowledge that maybe I've acquired over the years, and kind of use that to help support some of the content that's in the book. So if we could, let's get going with athletes. Uh, the book wants you to have these items, these bullet points in terms of kind of understand periodization, program design, etc. Know your cycles, know the different phases within a periodization program, how we can manipulate some of the rep and set variables and load to be able to elicit a training response. And a lot of this we've talked about, but this is where we're going to start to tie it together. So if we break this down in the book, we have factors in program design, training load, periodization, resistance training, periodization of resistance training, traditional and undulating modules of periodized resistance or periodization training. And then we have some of my own slide presentations. And I will tell you, when we start talking about periodization, you have a lot of moving variables that go into this, and you can whip up a wonderful program and have great rep and set schemes. But if you're programming great rep and set schemes over finals week or spring break or Christmas break, and you think you're going to have some great outcomes in terms of I'm going to have my athletes max out when they come back from Christmas break because they're all going to be working out the entire time, that's probably going to be a big letdown for you. So, you have to be able to look at some of what we're talking about in the book in the context of a yearly calendar and what goes into a yearly calendar when we're talking about college level or high school age athletes. When we're talking about your athletes who might be a weekend warrior, basketball player, et cetera, who plays in a Sunday league, that's a little bit different animal, right? But you still have to give credence to that. Now, when you work with populations of people in fitness centers, within reason. Now, if you're in a strength and conditioning facility in a college, this is going to have some kurtosis here. This distribution is going to be skewed. But when we look at this, most of the people that you're going to work with will be right at the mean. You're going to maybe have some people who are a little bit more athletic, maybe some people who have some prehab rehab concerns. The people who maybe had a open heart surgery, total knee replacement, total hip replacement, they're going to be out here in the red, a couple standard deviations over to the left. If you go the opposite direction and start talking about the people who play football on Sundays or run in the Olympics, you're talking several standard deviations out to the right. For most of the people, though, that you're going to come in contact with, they're going to be right here in the green. Perhaps you'll have a few in here. Perhaps you'll have a few college level athletes or high school age athletes that you'll work with in here. But again, if you go off and you're in a college strength and conditioning program, totally different animal. You're going to have a skewed distribution where everybody you work with is going to be an athlete. It's just now it becomes a different distribution within, it's a sub distribution basically within your normal distribution that you have with your athletes. You have 500 people you're working with and they're all athletes, so they're all going to be to the right on this particular distribution. But when you get into your athletic population, you'll have subcategories of each, just kind of go over and over. So what we're talking about with this in this presentation is this. We're talking about over to the right-hand side in terms of program design for athletes. Now, we've talked about specificity in training, and we've also talked about the overload principle. And, our bodies are incredibly good at adapting to stressors that we place on it. And working out is one of them. Weight training is one of them. And your body will adapt to that stressor very, very well, but it'll only adapt so far. So you have to have this progressive increase in overload to be able to have a progressive adaptation process. Otherwise, what ends up happening is your body will respond, go through the alarm stage, respond, it'll adapt, and it'll just kind of stay at homeostasis unless you change the intensity or the frequency or the volume or the load, or you add exercise variety, some kind of variable change in that process. Now, specificity refers to the fact that specific methods of training produce specific changes or results. And we've talked a little bit about this. If you want to train to be a baseball pitcher, you have to train differently than if you're a first baseman, third baseman, or an outfielder because of the energy demands required of your sport, and also beyond the energy demands, the physical demands of throwing a baseball over and over and over again. So you'd like to do activities that have a positive transfer to the sport, as the book notes here. And within specificity itself, um, I brought up that pyramid before where you go from general to specific and simple to complex, and you progress from kind of a hypertrophy phase up to a power then peaking phase. Well, in certain regards, you also have a different pyramid where you start off on the base for everything. You train for overall athleticism first. And then from training overall athleticism, you then progress to where you're training for the sport demands, then you train for the position demands. And at the very top of that pyramid, which I know I showed in a previous presentation, is the not the only the requirements, but maybe limitations that maybe an individual will have. Go back to our pitcher example, perhaps they had a Tommy John surgery and they have some limitations in their elbow, and you have to work with them in terms of how they warm up before they actually throw. So long story short, it's about meeting metabolic demands, it's about meeting physiological demands. It's about also applying the right stressor in terms of a psychological emotional component as well to get the training response that you want. And so this is one I've said before, I'm going to say it again. In program design, we go from general to specific, simple to complex. We go from stable to unstable, and depending upon the person, we might go from machine to barbell to dumbbell. And you overlay these variables on top of one another, and they're like little slide bars that you take going back and forth. Like, well, I'm going to go ahead and make this more specific, so I'm going to make it more complex. And I'm probably going to add a little bit of instability, and maybe I'll have some barbell. You can slide these back and forth when you're working with your athletes. And with maximal strength, it's often the the outcome that most coaches seek. They want their athletes to be super strong. They want them to be able to squat a ton. They want them to bench a farm animal, and which is great, but you also have to have the ability to have transferability, right? So you'd like to have this maximal strength, which is great. It's 100% important. But when you look at this, the ability to generate force at a very rapid speed requires training at high velocities is 100% on the mark. Most, if not all, sports require an increased velocity component to be able to be competitive. You're competing against the other person, unless you're competing on how to really slow down and fall asleep faster than the other person. It is all about being able to have a nice foundation to work from, and to a certain degree, when we talk about muscles, tendons, ligaments, and bones, all getting stronger, there's also the adaptation where your body gets better at being able to fire those muscles correctly, like we've talked about. And beyond that, your body gets better at being able to stabilize in a highly dynamic environment. That just doesn't happen. It requires training and proper movement prep for your athletes to be able to throw a baseball 100 miles an hour, but also have the musculature to be able to slow their arm down and decelerate their arm after they've thrown a ball 100 miles an hour. So there's a component to having maximal strength, but slow velocity, heavy resistance training does not ensure improvement in force development in ballistic sports. You have to use your maximal strength training in conjunction with power-oriented training. They can't be mutually exclusive. You have to use them together. And this is especially true when we're talking about power-oriented sports. You have to implement in power as a component, whether it's you're doing squats and on another day you're doing box jumps or you're doing power cleans, whatever that may be. If you're in a power-oriented sport, you need to train for power. If you're a speed-oriented sport, you need to train for speed or acceleration or vertical jump or whatever that may be. It's all about the specificity and training. All right, I'm going to move into the next presentation, guys.